Well, let's look at Psalm 32. It's written by David, and here's how the first, what I would call stanza of the song goes. Oh, what joy for those whose disobedience is forgiven, whose sin is put out of sight. Yes, what joy for those whose record the Lord has cleared of guilt, whose lives are lived in complete honesty. When I refused to confess my sin, my body wasted away, and I groaned all day long. Day and night, your hand of discipline was heavy on me. My strength evaporated like water in the summer heat. This is a little bit of an autobiographical song. Let's start at the beginning. Oh, what joy for those whose disobedience is forgiven. In a world, the world we live in, where obedience and disobedience, where sin and guilt those are often represented as archaic notions that only hold you down and hold you back. We lose, I think, it's easy for us to lose sight of the fact that whatever way you want to talk about it, sin has its punishment. There are consequences to our sin. And David's going to get into some of those consequences, but he begins not with his sin, but with reflecting on the joy for those whose disobedience is forgiven. I am so grateful that God is a forgiving God, that it's not like he pretends my disobedience didn't matter. It's not like he pretends, we'll just not, that's just not going to be a deal. Sort of, but not really, because think about this. For my sins to be forgiven, something had to happen that I am not capable of causing. David says he reflects on his own joy at experiencing forgiveness. The joy for those whose disobedience is forgiven, whose sin is put out of sight. It's not like God says, well, now that's like it never happened. I don't think wouldn't that be dishonest? But for God to say, I will put that sin out of sight, in the sense now that it won't come between you and me the way it would have without my forgiveness. The whole issue of forgiveness for me as an individual and as a counselor is one of the most significant, powerful, in fact, life-changing things. I'm trying to think if I have ever counseled someone who we didn't have to go to work on forgiving, because I don't remember it. There are the issues that bring people to me for counseling all have a connection back to a need to forgive and be forgiven, to experience forgiveness. I'm not sure which is harder. I think generally it's harder for us to forgive someone who hurt us than just about anything else. I've had people say, oh, I forgive really easily. And we'll talk about the injury, we'll talk about the hurt, and they'll go, well, I forgave that a long time ago. Really? Because I think it's still getting in your way. So that leads me to wonder if you really were able to forgive. I've talked about this before, but it bears repeating. Forgiveness is not an event. It's a process. Now, I think a lot of churches, well-meaning, good churches, people who love God, don't teach this. They teach it as forgive them and get it over with. Well, it's not like that. Small things maybe, but not the things that are of a nature that they are making your life more difficult than it needs to be, and your perception of life skewed and inaccurate and unhelpful. Here's the deal. Seems easy? It's not, okay? You and I, when we forgive another person, I guess I would say the struggle to forgive is in direct relationship to how deep the wound was. Isn't that kind of a principle from nature? I don't know if you can see it. I'm looking at it and I don't think you're going to be able to, but I got a scar that goes from here to there. And it's the result of a bicycle accident I had when I was 6 years old. And the surgeon had to slice my arm all the way down past the elbow joint because one bone went that way and one bone went that way. And he set it and pinned it and then he sewed it up. That was a deep wound. And when I got out of the hospital, they never put a hard cast on. It was a more of a splint sort of thing so that the wound could breathe, right? I was in that, I think, 6 or 8 weeks. That was a long time ago. That's 64 years ago, so it's a little bit fuzzy in my memory. But a deep wound takes time to heal and requires certain conditions in order to heal. You've done this too. You've gotten paper cuts on your hand or finger, and at my age, I scrape my knuckles on the door frame and I'll wind up with a big old ugly looking wound that heals in days because it's a surface wound. This principle holds true emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, as well as physically. There are deep emotional wounds that we sustain. Everybody does. And the healing of those wounds requires time and some certain conditions. To forgive a deep wound, get ready, because this is a game changer, and you got to have a PhD to get there. Not, because here's the truth, and the principle is, when you get a deep wound like that, it's going to take time for you to forgive the one who gave you that wound. And part of it is that we will bump that wound, and when we bump that wound, we re-experience a measure of the original injury. How does that happen? It doesn't happen physically. It happens with memories. It happens with triggers. This sometimes surprises people, but there are fragrances, there are aromas and smells that trigger a memory of a deep wound or the memory of a very good and positive and happy memory. Well, in terms of the wounding, it is not happy. And when we are triggered to recall the experience of being wounded, we often are going to re-experience the injury. We don't just remember it. This is hard. Now, often people will say, okay, I've forgiven them of that. And then they have a trigger like I've talked about, and they re-experience the injury, and they go, I thought I forgave them of that. What's up? Well, here's what's up. What you have to do, the only way that I can, in my experience and my training, the only way I know of that a person can experience giving forgiveness is to engage it as a process, so that every time the memory of that injury comes to me, it's really just a reminder that I must choose again to forgive that person for that injury. Sounds easy. You just choose to forgive. There's a great book by the title is Choosing to Forgive, and it's a workbook that if you are struggling to forgive someone, I just highly recommend go on Amazon or wherever you buy your books and purchase the book Choosing to Forgive, and then read it and work it. There are things about this forgiveness process that can be very emotionally fatiguing, because I have this belief about myself that I could get over this a lot more quickly than it seems like I'm getting over it. What's wrong with that? I'm stronger than that. I'm smarter than that. I'm better than that. I'm closer to Jesus than... No. Because here is a very, I don't know what to call it. It is essential truth. You're a human. All humans struggle to forgive deep wounds. So don't criticize yourself if you're having trouble with that. Just choose again to forgive. And if I have to choose 1,000 times, I will choose that. Eventually, having chosen to forgive and chosen to forgive and chosen to forgive 1,000 times, how do I know that I've forgiven? Well, it comes down to when I remember the offense, it doesn't re-injure me. That's going to take time. So we have to be patient with ourselves in this process of forgiving. But when we do that for others, it gives us life. But when we experience God having done that for us, that's the ultimate life that we experience. It's joy for those whose disobedience is forgiven, whose sin is put out of sight. Now, let's kind of frame this quickly in the last minute. David didn't know. I think he knew that it was coming, because he prophesied the coming of Jesus and wrote a very compelling psalm, Psalm 22, that talks about we look at it now and realize he was talking about the death of Jesus. But he wouldn't have been able to experience Jesus' forgiveness the way we can. For us, 1 John 1:9 is the truth to cling to. It simply says, when we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sin and purify us from all unrighteousness. And that's a huge feeling. It's hard though, because sometimes I know he has forgiven me. I struggle to forgive me. We'll talk a little more about that next time on Soul Care with Stevie.